Hello friends, tonight we step into a world where the cold isn't just weather, it's a nightmare that tears through flesh and soul. This is the story of the Britons in the Dark Ages, when every breath, every blanket, and even every drop of blood was a bloody, desperate fight for survival. Forget any romantic notions of the past, because the truth is so harsh, you might not survive even a single night. Before you lean back comfortably, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I share. And leave a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see people following from all over the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some background noise, and let's step into tonight's journey together. Tonight we begin with something colder than history. A winter so brutal even the sun gave up. No electricity, no heaters, no puffy jackets, and absolutely no such thing as a bedroom. We're going back to Dark Age Britain, post-Roman times, where the Britons didn't just live in the shadow of a fallen empire, but had to survive winters that could freeze the soul itself. No firewood, no meat, no hope, just endless snow, howling winds like demonic screams, and a tattered tent you call home. If you're lucky, you have a blanket. If you're unlucky, you are the blanket for someone else. Night falls as fast as a whip's lash, and when the sun sets, the temperature doesn't just drop below zero, it drops below humanity. Today, you're not a king, not a knight, not even a storyteller at a feast by the hearth. You're a nameless Briton peasant, with no land, and no one coming to save you. You used up your last firewood last week, you ate your last watery porridge last night, and this morning, you found out someone stole your only pair of shoes while you slept. Maybe it was your brother, maybe your mother, maybe it was you, in a hunger-induced sleepwalk. Jay, you might have burned them last night, and don't even remember. It's fine, you still have feet, and maybe you don't need them much anymore, as they're starting to turn purple. The world outside is full of ice. The world inside is full of smoke and coughing. People start looking at each other like potential food. No one says it, but everyone thinks it. And from this moment on, you'll understand why so many ancient legends involve cannibalism. Stew. But before that happens, you must learn to make friends with fire, with darkness, and with yourself, when everything else abandons you. We'll live through each day of that winter together. Each night, each howling gust, each tiny decision that could kill you or someone you love. This isn't a story for fun, it's a survival map, and you're right in the middle of it. Ready? Because winter waits for no one. And it's just knocked on your door, with the howl of wind piercing through the tent's walls, with the thin layer of ice crusting over your eyelids when you wake, and with the familiar tremble that doesn't come from fear, but from your very bones. The first morning of real cold arrives without warning. When you open your eyes, you see your breath turn to white mist in the space called a bedroom, a corner of dirt lined with dry grass, next to a stone you use as a pillow. No one wakes up at the same time, because no one really sleeps. All night, everyone just huddles together, trying to survive a few more hours. Your little brother, what's his name again? Maybe Rydian, or Glyn, or something that doesn't matter anymore, is rubbing his head against your back, his breath warming it, just enough for you to hate him when he turns away, and then you hear it. Scratch, scratch, short, light, and deliberate. The first rat. In another life, you'd be disgusted, but now, that sound is like a spoon stirring soup, something to eat. You don't know why rats still survive. Maybe they have a better place than you. Maybe they don't need blankets. Maybe they're smarter. But a rat is a meal, and you're proud you spotted it first. You quietly sit up, your hand digging under the straw, where you hid your flattest stone. Every move has to be precise. One wrong step, and the rat will escape, and you know you'll cry. Not loudly, but enough for others to hear. And no one cries over a rat. When the stone slams down, you hear a clean crack. No blood splatters, just a small sound, like a bone breaking. You lift it, and see the rat there, curled up, eyes bulging, as if it saw its fate coming. You don't wait for anyone to ask. You head outside, find 2 half-burned sticks from last night, and restart the smoldering coals. The smoke rises pale green. The wind whistles through the wooden cracks, as if the sky itself is mocking your effort. But you don't care, because you have a rat, and you're still alive. The smell of roasting meat spreads so fast that within minutes, your sister, who hasn't spoken to you in 2 weeks because you accidentally broke a pot, walks over. She says nothing, just looks. You don't speak either. You know if you give it to her, you'll go hungry. If you don't, she'll remember. She'll remember when you need a blanket, or when you're asleep, or when you're shaking with fever and need someone to fetch water. You tear the rat in half, hand her the tail end. She takes it, no thanks, but you see something in her eyes, forgiveness, or maybe compromise. In this world, a rat is currency, and you just bought a bit of peace. The days that follow see every tent start rat hunting. Some set traps with thorny vines, others wait at night to stalk. One kid nearly died when a rat bit his ear, but he didn't complain, because the next morning, his father roasted that rat for the whole family. Blood was already spilled. No sense wasting it. The problem is, the rats get smarter. They stop running through the tents. They vanish like your grandfather's ghost after last year's fever. And just when you think things are stabilizing, when your stomach starts getting used to scheduled hunger, the snow starts falling for real. Not the cute white flakes you imagined from Roman tales, but slabs of ice slapping your face like a hand. And you realize today is the first day of the death month. You don't count by calendars, you count by coughs. Every winter, the cough spreads like the plague. When it turns wet, you know someone's about to go. And tonight, that someone might be you. You try to stay warm with straw, moldy hides, whispered words no one answers. You think of the rat, the best meal you had all week, and you wish for just one more, not to eat, but to feel like you're still winning at something, even just once. But rats aren't stupid, and winter's only just begun. And the first thing it teaches you is nothing matters more than firewood. Not food, not blankets, not prayers. Keep you warm like a steady burning log. But you didn't prepare. No one in the village did, because last summer was deceptively long. Warm winds lasted until late October. The sun peeked through morning mists, and you, like everyone else, told yourself, maybe this year will be gentle. Then boom, snow falls, winds rush in, fires go out, and there's nothing to burn. At first people try to stay calm. Just a few cold days, the elders say, we've been through it all. They add, huddling in cloaks and coughing like rotting oaks. But after 3 nights, reassurances turn to groans. From morning to night, you hear knocks at the village chief's tent, the only one with a private wood stash, locked with iron chains, and guarded by a one-eyed dog. They come to beg, plead, then curse. Finally they break things. You go too. That night, you go with your mother. You carry a dull axe, not to threaten, but to trade for a bundle of wood. But he just stands there, leaning against a post, hands on hips, voice like cold stone. No trades. Survive if you can. Your mother kneels. You've never seen her do that. Not because she's proud, but because her knees are riddled with arthritis. But she kneels, and the fire in his eyes doesn't budge. That night, you burn the wooden chair your father left behind. It's the last proper piece of wood in the tent, and its smoke stings your eyes all evening. Not from sentiment, because painted wood burns toxic. In the days that follow, people start tearing down fences, not to go anywhere, to burn. The longer someone's fence, the faster it disappears. You no longer see familiar paths between tents. Everything becomes a field of ash. Then they burn doors, house posts, kitchen racks. One family uses their ancestral altar to roast a piece of cat meat. They cry as they light the fire, then laugh as the warmth spreads. But housewood doesn't last forever, and after a week, the first deaths begin. Not loud, not dramatic, just someone who sleeps and doesn't wake, or sits motionless by an extinguished fire, eyes wide open as if listening to music, but with frozen ears. Once, you hear a scream at midnight. You run out and see an old woman standing in the snowy courtyard, arms raised, muttering something. Her hair is caked with ice. When you get close, she's already dead, but her body still stands, like a statue. The next morning, no one buries her. They just wrap her in cloth and warm themselves beside her, because the wind from the dead isn't cold. A family of 6 vanishes in one night. They lived at the village's edge. When the villagers find out, There's nothing left in their tent but a pile of ash smelling of human fat. No one says it, but everyone knows firewood doesn't grow on its own. You start learning to sniff out anything burnable: dry branches, roofs, withered vines. But everything's damp, and the fire only half burns. The smoke so thick you gag every time you light the hearth. One day, you risk sneaking into the chief's house, not to steal wood, just to see if he's still there. And he is, curled up by his woodpile like a snake, arms wrapped around 2 oak logs as thick as thighs. He's asleep, but his eyes aren't closed. His mouth curls into a smile. You back away and close the door. At that moment, you haven't killed anyone, but someone else has. The next morning, word spreads. He's dead. No one investigates. No one asks. His firewood vanishes that night. And suddenly, the village air feels a bit warmer. Not because there's more fire, but because people feel justice has been served. Everyone keeps living, or rather keeps not to dying. You burn anything you can: old cloth, Roman books, ropes, shed animal fur. Once you gather dried dung mixed with straw to boil water. The smell is horrific, but everyone drinks, because warm water beats ice. You realize you're learning to live without morals, learning to burn memories to survive one more night. By the end of the 3rd week, no one talks about getting through winter. No one asks, when will spring come? Because spring isn't a concept anymore. There's only today, and today, you need to find firewood. If not, you'll be the next one sitting motionless with open eyes, like the old woman in the snowy courtyard, and no one will bury you, but they'll remember you when they see the fire flicker, and the smoke stings their eyes just when they need a bit of warmth. Warmth is enough. It doesn't matter what they're burning. It doesn't matter who it belonged to. And then you realize, here, everyone starts as a peasant. But this winter, no one ends it with clean hands. Death by cold doesn't pick the virtuous. It picks the slow, the deep sleepers, those who don't strike when they must. And you don't want to be the one lying there, still while others warm themselves beside you. That night, you stare at the damp straw smoldering faintly, your mouth bitter with ash, eyes stinging from the wind, hands trembling from hunger. The tent next door still has fire. You hear the crackle of dry wood burning steadily, like a call from another world. They have wood, and they're not dying. But you're sitting here, next to a pile of mud, clutching your knees, imagining your back pressed against a warm stone wall. Then you stand, not because you have a plan, but because if you don't, you'll lie there until morning. And morning might be forever. You walk like a sleepwalker. The night is deep, the wind cuts through the rotting forest posts, cold like needles pricking your face. You skirt the village's edge, heading straight for that tent. You don't plan to take much. Just a few sticks. Just enough to stop your hands from shaking. Enough to stop your brother from whimpering in his dreams. You don't want to steal. You want to live, and winter doesn't distinguish between the two. You slip through a familiar gap behind their tent. They don't lock it, because no one expects a neighbor to turn thief. They're wrong. You enter, quiet as the wind you're cursing. In the dark, you see nothing, just the smell of fresh wood, and the lingering warmth of human presence. You spot the firewood, a big bundle, and a small one. You aim for the small one, reach out, then there's a rustle. A child lies near the woodpile, not asleep, eyes wide open, like they knew you'd come. You freeze. They look at you like you're a demon. No crying, no calling out, just staring. Long enough that you want to say something, but you don't. You pick up the small bundle, as lightly as you can, and turn away. As you slip out, you still hear the wind, but this time, it's not as cold as that child's gaze. The next morning, you burn the wood. Your whole family is silent. No one asks where it came from. They just hold their hands toward the fire. Your mother places a knife by the hearth, not to warn you, but to be ready for next time, like a silent agreement. Your brother breathes steadily, lips moving, as if dreaming of sunlight. You can't sleep, because you know tonight, they'll notice the missing wood, and that child's gaze won't leave your memory. 3 days later, you see the child's mother crying outside their tent. No one comforts her. No one stops, because everyone has their own grief, and everyone's taken something that wasn't theirs. The only difference is whether they've been caught yet. Then it's your turn, not to be caught, to be robbed. One night, you come back to find your tent wide open. The firewood's gone. The pot of boiling water's still there, but the fire's out. Your brother lies curled up in the dark, lips purple, eyes shut tight. Someone came in, quieter than you, faster than you, and cold enough to take back justice. You don't cry, you don't get angry, you just feel a strange sensation, recognition, that now you're not just a victim, you're part of the cycle. A link in the survival machine, fueled by fear and revenge. From that day, you change. You hide your wood elsewhere, buried under damp straw, covered with stones. You learn don't put all your eggs in one basket, or all your wood in one corner. You listen for the crackle of fire from afar. Which tents still have flames? Which ones send up fragrant smoke? You learn to gauge a roof's warmth to know if someone's heating inside, and if they are, they have wood. If they have wood, they're vulnerable. You become the person you once feared, and you feel no shame. Because every time you bring back a bundle of wood, you see your brother smile. You see your mother sleep without curling up. And you feel yourself still breathing, still walking, still hearing the wind without shuddering. Then you don't just take wood. One day, you see someone drop a piece of dried meat near their hearth. You don't return it. You grab it, stuff it inside your shirt, and walk away. No looking back. They shout, but they don't chase. Maybe because they've done it too. You start noticing knives, shortcuts, the moments when others sleep deepest. You're no longer a peasant. You're a hunter, but not for beasts. You hunt others' mistakes, their carelessness, their trust, your winter's consequence. And in others' eyes, you're something no one wants to face, but everyone fears becoming. And you understand when the cold claws at your heart, morality snaps like a dry branch in the fire. You didn't choose to become a thief. You just didn't want to be the next body warmed beside. And here, sometimes surviving means trading everything, even yourself. But there's one line you haven't crossed, a boundary you still hold, thin as a hair and fragile as a breath. It's others' fires, not their stored wood, not a quick scoop of soup, but the fire, the burning, flickering, red flame, with someone sitting by it, someone watching, because a hearth is the last thing Britons still respect. Not kings, not priests, not ancestors, but fire. No one touches another's flame, unless invited, because it's not just warmth, it's territory, it's trust, it's a silent declaration. I'm still alive, and I'm strong enough to protect this. But winter drags on, and fires burn and die out, and need relighting. And relighting means wood, strength, people. When you're down to one rotting stick and a shattered faith, someone else's fire becomes the most tempting thing in the world. A trembling light in the deep night, like a heart still beating in a dead man's chest. You don't dare approach, but you can't look away. And you're not the only one. It happens on the 34th night of winter, or the 50th, or no one's counting anymore. The old couple's tent at the village's end. People say they had a son who fought for the Romans, brought back a real iron sword, the kind of metal now only in legends. They always have a fire. Always. No one knows what they burn. No one dares ask. Until one night, someone walks in. No permission. No knock. No words exchanged. Just shouting. Then a hiss. Then silence. The next morning, their tent still has smoke, but the couple's gone. People say they moved away. No one believes it. Who moves in the middle of winter? You know there are only two reasons a fire changes hands. Either the owners die of cold, or they're killed, leaving the fire still burning. From then on, everyone's on guard. People sleep by their hearth, knives under pillows. Some sleep sitting up to watch the flames. Families take turns guarding. Those who laughed loudly and talked much in summer now whisper with their eyes. No one turns their back on the coals. And if someone offers to let you warm by their fire, you refuse, because warming by their fire means debt, and a fire debt can make people kill over a handful of smoldering ash. Another night, you hear a loud thud outside. A man, probably a wanderer, collapses outside your tent, face swollen, blood frozen into ice. He mumbles something about, "Give me, just a little, just a bit," then falls face down. You want to pull him in, but you see your mother's eyes, a slight shake of her head, no words, not because she's cruel, but because she doesn't want you to do something that'll haunt you for life. You leave him there. By morning, He's just a body, hard as a log, and someone comes to take it away, not to bury. After that, you learn one more thing. The hearth is the warmest place, and also the most dangerous in the village. It's no longer a symbol of life. It's the final stronghold, where people fight with glares, daggers, and the rawest desperation to hold on to a bit of power, a bit of control, in the white chaos. You see a man kill his brother because he spilled soup on the fire, not for the food, but because losing the fire means going outside to relight it, and going outside means maybe never coming back. You see a wife throw her husband out of the tent because he fell asleep and let the fire die. The man wanders 3 days before returning, missing half his fingers. And once, you nearly die. You just wanted to borrow some embers. Your fire went out after an ice storm. You brought a bundle of wet straw, begging for just a spark to start it. But the woman, someone who gave you a spoonful of porridge last summer, looks at you like a stranger. Then she pulls a knife. Then she screams, "Get away from my fire." You don't argue. You back away, hands shaking, chest pounding. Behind you is snow. In front of you, glowing coals. And between them is an uncrossable gap that used to be neighborly kindness. You return empty-handed. No fire, no apology, no illusions about goodness. That night, you use straw mixed with grease scraps from an old pot to start a black smoky fire, smelling like burning rot, and you guard it all night, knife in hand, eyes unblinking, because you know tonight you're the target. From that day you learn to make fire from what others discard: shoe soles, fallen hair, dry moss, and sometimes something odd, like cloth, with a fishy smell, or a half-burned bone of unknown origin. You don't ask.
You just burn.
And guard, and are ready to kill anyone who comes near, because the hearth is no longer a gathering place.
It's a fortress, a weapon.
The last belief that you're still human, and that someone somewhere will remember your name when spring returns. If it returns, if you live long enough to see it. But the next morning, you see your son, the boy who used to draw suns with ash on the tent wall whenever he was hungry, sitting on the ground, scooping handfuls of cold mud and shoving them into his mouth. No whining, no crying, no begging, just silently chewing dirt, as if it's some kind of bread you've never tasted, and you stand frozen, not from shock, but because you know this is the moment a child starts slipping out of the human world. You rush forward, your hands yank his from his mouth, so hard he screams.
You yell.
Not out of anger, but fear. Fear that he's crossed some invisible line where no one comes back. You look into his eyes, red, wet, and strangely empty. No resistance, no questions, just acceptance. The kind of acceptance of someone who knows they're about to dissolve into dust and doesn't care anymore. You ask, "Why are you eating dirt?" He answers simply, "Dirt isn't cold." That answer hits you like a stab to the chest. Dirt isn't cold. That's the reason. In this tent, where warmth is a faint concept, where food vanished weeks ago, dirt is the only thing soft, solid, and accepting. The boy isn't lying. You touch the tent's dirt floor. It's true. Not as cold as the wind, not as sharp as snow. It's lukewarm, damp, and doesn't reject anyone. It doesn't bite. It doesn't need a dagger to guard. Not like a hearth. Not like the villagers. Not like you. That night, you don't sleep. You watch your son like he's a strange creature. You see him curl up in a corner, occasionally reaching for the dirt, sneaking tiny bits into his mouth when he thinks you're not looking. You don't stop him. You don't have the strength to argue. You just wonder, will eating dirt kill him faster or keep him alive longer? The next morning, you ask the village priest, the man still alive, still calling himself the god's messenger, despite once eating rotten bird meat and claiming it was a sacrifice. You ask, "Is eating dirt bad?" He looks at you like you asked if the sun is hot. Then he says, "If it's from the east side, it's fine. The west side is dangerous." You ask why. He replies, "Because the west is where the death god lives." You don't believe him, but you don't argue, because you have no better options. You return. You take a spoon, the only clean thing left, and start scooping dirt from the east side of the tent. You lightly roast it on a hot iron to kill the stench, then give it to your son. He eats. No reaction, no joy, no disgust, just acceptance. You start watching others, and you realize your family isn't the only one. The kid next door chews on dry roots. The old woman living alone picks strange mushrooms from the mud. A girl who once had the brightest laugh in the village now chews cloth scraps to forget the bitterness in her mouth. No one admits it. No one speaks up. But empty stomachs make people eat anything that doesn't claw back, and dirt resists the least. One day, your son coughs violently. His face is moss green, eyes glassy. You panic. You think the dirt is killing him, but it's a fever, a high fever, shaking uncontrollably. You try wiping him down with cold cloth while outside. Snow starts falling again. You run to beg for fire, but every tent is shut. You pound on your sister's door, the one who shared a rat's tail with you. No one opens. You shout, you scream, not to beg, but to let them know you still exist. In the end, you burn the small stone statue of Bran, the god your ancestors protected with their lives. You don't believe in gods anymore. You just need heat, and in the purple blaze your son opens his eyes, then falls asleep, and the next morning he wakes. You're relieved, but you also realize you just burned a piece of your family's soul to keep a child alive who's learning to survive on dirt. A few days later, your son stops eating dirt, but he doesn't eat anything else either. He just sits, drawing circles in the ground, over and over, as if trying to remember something. Maybe bread, maybe sunlight, maybe the smell of porridge his mother used to cook in autumn. But whatever it is, it's not here anymore. You sit beside him. You scoop a handful of dirt too, bring it to your nose, smell it, and you understand why he did it. Dirt smells of old life, of grass, of manure, of the sweat of people tilling fields, of summers that once existed. And in this world, where memories are the only thing not stolen, eating dirt is a way to cling to a piece of humanity. You don't eat, but you don't stop anyone anymore. Let them eat what they want, as long as they're alive, because winter doesn't kill with hunger. It kills with despair. And your son somehow just taught you that, through a handful of cold dirt on a moonless night. And when dawn breaks, you realize you can't move your right thumb. It's swollen, purple, stiff as a stick buried in snow too long. At first, you think it's from sleeping wrong, but by noon, the pain spreads to your wrist. Every time you try to close your hand, the cracked, dry skin tears until blood seeps through the dirty cloth wrapped around it. You don't scream, but you bite your teeth until they bleed, just so your son doesn't see. He just stopped eating dirt. You don't want him to start again, because he sees his father losing a hand. You call it deadly dry hand, because everyone you've seen with it, first cracked skin, then purple, then rotting joint by joint, didn't survive the week. Some lost entire hands. Some cut them off early, but still died from infection. Some couldn't bear the pain and threw themselves into a still red fire. This winter, you don't need a knife to die, just a small crack and silence that lasts too long. You try soothing it with sheep fat, a luxury you once saved for the kids, but there's nothing greasy enough to sink in. Your skins turn to ash, your pinky curls inward, and one morning, you wake with a jolt when something falls on your chest. A finger joint. No blood, no flesh, just a tiny bone, like a broken twig. You stare at it for a long time, wondering whether to keep it as a memento or toss it into the fire for a bit more heat. In the end, you bury it in the dirt, along with things you thought you could never endure. The priest has no name for this disease in his books. He says it's the god's punishment for burning the statue. You don't argue, you don't believe, but you quietly notice you're not the only one. The young girl who washed her hands in cold water every morning to keep them pale has lost 3 fingers. A burly man, the village's old blacksmith, scraped his cracks with a stone and died of blood poisoning 3 days later. Everyone hides their hands in their clothes, but the smell of rotting flesh doesn't hide. Tents with the sick grow quiet, with no visitors. You start to understand this disease is death's knock at the door, not coughing, not hunger, but cracked hands that can't grip, can't hold fire, can't chase rats or hug loved ones. Once you lose your hands, there's only one path waiting for someone else to choose your time. One day, someone in the village is caught throwing their friend's body into a snow pit behind a tent. Why? Because they lost their pinky. People start judging sickness by gestures. Those who hide their hands too well are suspected. Those who can't tear hard bread are watched. Once, a child ran crying through the village, holding up a cracked palm. His mother fainted, and the next morning their tent was empty. No one knows where they went. Just a pile of dead coals and a half-burned cloth remained. You decide to hide your sickness as long as possible. You learn to tie your fingers together with thorny vines. Every morning, you plunge your hands into snow to numb the pain. That way, you won't wince when you move. Your son asks, "Are you cold, father?" You nod. He offers you his scarf, the one he's kept since his mother was alive. You don't dare wear it. You just hold it, pressing it to the hand that's losing its humanity. One morning, you hear a rumor. Someone cured their dry hand. The news spreads faster than wind. They talk of an old woman in the forest who uses mushrooms, beeswax, and fermented urine as a salve. Some swear they met her. Some vow her cure saved all 5 fingers. But no one leads the way. No one knows which forest. They just heard it from someone else. You're desperate enough to believe. You prepare to go. The first time leaving the tent in nearly a month. Your son clings to you. You push him back, but he cries. He says, "If you go, I go." And you realize this boy is no longer the child who ate dirt. He's learned winter in a way only survivors do. You head into the forest, wade through deep snow, wind slicing your face like razors. Your hand is numb. Your arm feels like a dangling stone. But you go, as if an invisible thread pulls you to the last place people still speak of hope. You don't find the old woman, but you find a cave. Inside, there's ash, traces of an old fire, and a torn sack with something slimy. You open it. The stench hits you. But there's also something sweet. Maybe wax, maybe mushrooms, maybe what the old woman used. You don't care. You grab a handful, stuff it into your shirt, and head back. That night, you rub it on your hand. It burns, then stings, then heats like it's on fire. You don't sleep. You just watch your hand, waiting for it to fall off. But the next morning, it's still there, purpler, but there. You laugh. Not loudly, not genuinely, but it's the first laugh you've let out in a long time. You share a bit with your neighbor, the one who broke your pot last summer. No words, just leave it at their door. The next morning, smoke rises from their tent. They're still alive. You lose 2 more fingers, but you live. You learn to hold a knife with your whole hand instead of fingers. You light fires with your wrist. You fetch water with your elbow. You're living proof you don't need full hands to survive this winter. But you also know the cost of losing parts of your body is losing parts of your humanity. You can't comfort your son anymore. Can't hug him when he cries from nightmares. You just sit close, letting your breath warm his neck, like a smoldering fire from someone no longer whole. You still teach him how to live, not with words, but with endurance, by not dying even when death raises its hand before you, even when you hide your hand in your clothes to conceal what you've lost and what you'll never get back. But as long as you have one hand, even maimed, even cold, even curled, you can keep your son alive one more day. And in this place, one more day is a victory. But then comes a day when you realize your victory, your son's, your whole fragile tent, has reached its limit. Because the cold doesn't ease, the snow doesn't melt, death doesn't slow, and the forest god, the one your village still whispers to when storms rage or snakes slither into barns, no longer answers. You used to believe that if you prayed hard enough, lit enough sweet grass, scattered enough ash at the old oak's roots, the forest god would take pity and pull back the cold. But this year, the oak snapped, the ash is wet, and the wind laughs in your face every time you kneel. No omens, no birdsong, no guiding dreams, just one clear reality. Your tent is steadily freezing, and your son is returning to his old habit, sucking on your missing fingers for any lingering warmth. You sit for hours by the dead hearth, thinking of what you have left. Cloth, torn, wood gone, dirt, frozen, meat, a hallucination. And then your eyes land on the tent's corner, where your last living goat lies trembling, eyes wide with constant panic. It's the only creature you haven't thought of as food, not out of love, but because it's the last thing truly alive, still breathing, still afraid, still turning its head to look at you, as if it knows what you're thinking. It used to give milk, pull wood, warm the tent with its body heat. It was a member of your tent. Your son named it Dara, strong, in Old Brittonic. But now, everything strong has either died or vanished. And if you do nothing, your son will follow. You don't decide to kill it in a sudden impulse. It takes 3 days to accept. Each night, you watch it curled in the corner, hear it chew the last moldy straw, then hear it whimper in its dreams like a person. Those 3 nights, you don't sleep. You play the scene over and over in your mind, holding the knife with your wrist, pressing deep, fast blood spilling on the cold ground, and heat rising like morning mist. You don't want to remember, but you force yourself to memorize it before acting. On the 4th morning, you wake earlier than usual. Your son is still asleep. Dry dirt clings to his lips. Unwashed, you walk to Dara. It looks at you. No struggling, no running, just looking. And you understand it knows too. Maybe the forest god spoke to it. Or maybe it prayed too, and was met with silence. You place the knife at its throat. The blade is dull, so you cut twice. The first time, no blood. The second, you collapse. Not from exhaustion, but because its final cry sounds like a child calling for its mother. But when the blood flows, you feel your body warm, not psychological, real. The blood is warm, and in that moment, you know fire isn't the only thing that can heat you. You carve the meat, your hands shake, botching many cuts. Most of the organs are mangled, unusable, but there's still the legs, the back fat, the heart. You put it all in a pot, add dirty water, light a fire with wood scraps and hair, and watch. The smell of boiling meat spreads like magic. It's unlike anything you've known, not like watery porridge, not like roasted rat, not like anything. It's the smell of memory, of when you were a child, when your mother cooked rabbit stew for harvest festivals, and you cry, not from hunger, not from pain, but because the scent reminds you that you were once human. Your son wakes to the smell. He doesn't ask, just sits beside you, hand on your knee. You ladle him a bowl, carefully, evenly, like an offering. He eats, each spoonful slow, and when he finishes, he looks at you. Was it Dara, father? You don't answer, but your eyes do. He doesn't cry, just says, thank you, Dara, then turns to the tent wall and falls asleep. You keep the bones, bury them by the broken oak. You light a bundle of dry grass, a final ritual for the forest god, not to beg, but to say, I managed on my own. No one comes, no omens, but you feel lighter. After that day, others start killing their animals. A dog is hung on a branch before its throat is cut. A rooster vanishes from the priest's tent. A litter of rabbits is split between 4 tents. Everyone says, there's nothing left to lose. But you know they saw the light from your tent. The warmth, your son standing straighter after weeks curled like a sickle, and they understand to live, you must sacrifice. That night, you pray again, not to the forest god, but to the goat, to Dara. You say, I'm sorry, and in the silence, you feel someone rest their chin on your knee, light, warm, like Dara used to. But when you open your eyes, no one's there, only the snow outside slows. The wind stops howling, and the fire, though small, burns until morning without needing more wood. Maybe the forest god forgave you, or maybe for the first time in weeks, you became the god of your own tent, and you realize gods don't live in oak branches or behind the mist. They live in every decision, every cut, every glance you give to those you must kill, to keep the ones you love alive one more day. But sometimes, even when you've sacrificed everything, even killed the only thing still called a friend, winter doesn't relent. And then something shifts, not in the wind, not in the snow, but in the villagers' eyes, the day the first small body is wrapped in sheepskin and placed beneath the charred oak. No one knows exactly when that child died. One morning, its mother, a girl not yet 20, with hair once golden like August grass, carried her frozen child through the village, silent, tearless, unbegging, just walking, her feet bleeding from no shoes, her hands cracked like drought-torn earth, and she laid the child down, gentle as if placing spare firewood, then sat beside it, back straight, eyes fixed on the icy clouds descending. No one approached, no one asked. The first death always paralyzes a community, because it shatters the thin belief that we still control something. Children aren't supposed to die first. That's the unspoken rule. They can starve, cry, suck on bony fingers, but they must live. Because if they don't, what's the point of anything else? But now it's dead, and the silence begins. A silence that lasts not hours, not a day, but nearly a month. No funeral, no cries. The mother sat by her child's body for 3 days, until her eyes turned to stone, her lips sealed, unable to speak her child's name, her skin darkening, like the body she held. On the 3rd day, someone quietly took her back to her tent. No one buried the child. They just draped another hide over it and left it there, a reminder that this winter has no rules. From that day, no one in the village spoke. They gestured, they glanced. Even the children stopped playing. Everyone seemed to wait for the next death, and the next death didn't make them cry anymore. It only made them quieter. Each body was placed beside the first child, like a silent punishment sent to the forest god, the hearth god, any god, as long as someone felt guilty. But no one answered. No strange dreams, no omens, just wind endlessly whipping your face when you left the tent, and a feeling like living in a world with its sound cut off, where everything sacred had its cord severed. In your tent, your son is silent too. He doesn't mention Darah anymore, doesn't bring up the old scarf. He just sits, staring at your shrinking hand, drawing circles in the ash on the ground, as if trying to hold on to something whole. You want to say something, anything, but your throat feels sealed with ice. Maybe you're no longer sure you can say words like "it's okay" or "it'll pass," because it's not okay, and nothing proves it'll pass. One night, you hear sobs from the next tent, not crying, but the kind of choked gasp held back too long, bursting out distorted. You want to knock, but your feet won't move. You're afraid that if you speak first, everything in you will break, and once broken, you don't know if you'll have the strength to piece it back together. The next morning, you find a small cat's body left outside your tent. Not a threat, a gift. Cats are valuable now at least, and someone gave it to you, meaning someone still wants you to live. You don't thank them, you just light the fire, cook soup with snow water, and call your son. He smells the meat, but says nothing, just eats quietly, head down. For the first time in days, he sleeps without dreaming. But you sit by the fire, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the door. The silence hasn't lifted, but you realize it's no longer punishment, it's a defense. An invisible communal shell, keeping each person from evaporating like morning breath. Silence is how the village holds each other, without touching the pain. And at that moment, you understand in this winter, no one cries loudly, no one screams, no one begs. They just sit by their child's body, eyes dry, hearts numb, waiting for some god, if one exists, to decide who'll be the next child. But one morning, the villagers seem to run out of patience, to wait for gods to choose. They want to blame. They need a clear, tangible reason, with a shape and an address, for the endless storm, the unyielding cold, the growing pile of bodies beneath the charred oak. And so, every eye turns to a small, isolated tent at the village's edge, home to an old widow who hasn't stepped out in over 3 weeks. Her name is Alwyn, but no one's called her that in years. They call her Raven's Shadow, the muttering fire whisperer, the one who didn't cry when her husband died, the one who planted trees that never grew. Names no one verifies, but everyone knows by heart, as if she was born to be suspected. Alwyn used to be a midwife, a healer, keeper of ancient leaf recipes, and rubbing oils from ancestral times. But, in a winter where faith in medicine is buried with frozen children, a healer becomes a spreader of disease. And what scares people most isn't any specific skill, but her quiet survival while the village rots away. Why isn't she sick? Someone asks. Why does her fire never go out? Another adds. Why, when storms come, do you hear singing from her tent? Someone claims to have heard. No proof needed, just fear. And the cold makes people scared enough to believe anything. That afternoon, 5 men with knives and broken iron rods walk to her tent. They don't need to speak, just nod. A crowd gathers behind, no one wanting to strike first, but all wanting to watch. You're in that crowd, not out of curiosity, but because you can't not be. Here, if you stay in your tent when the village goes to cleanse, you'll be the next one named. When Aelwen's tent door opens, she shows no fear, her wrinkled face, darkened by fire smoke, but eyes still clear as unfrozen well water. She looks at each person, saying nothing. The first man steps forward, but stops halfway. The second's hand shakes. Finally, a teenage boy shouts, "You're a witch. You kept the fire for yourself. You made my child freeze." His yell shatters the village's silent wall. People start shouting too. A stone flies. Then a burning handful of straw is tossed onto her tent's roof. And in minutes, the tent is ablaze. But Aelwen doesn't run. She stands in the flames, eyes unblinking. No begging, no defense. As if she knew this ending was written long ago. When the fire dies, no one puts it out. No one approaches. They just look, then turn away. Everyone's face is strangely calm, not triumphant, not guilty, just as if they completed an ancient ritual. One no one taught, but everyone knows. That night, snow still falls. The village fires don't burn brighter. The dead don't return. But people sleep better, not from warmth, but because they've found an answer for their pain. An answer named an old woman. No one mourns. You don't sleep. You sit by your son, listening to each gust of wind, each sound outside the tent. You don't know what you're waiting for. Maybe a song in the wind, like the rumors about Aelwen. But there's nothing, just an emptiness in your chest, like you helped kill the one person who might have known how to save a rotting hand. And the next morning, when you see a purple rash on your son's leg, a mark you've seen on dozens of bodies before, you know winter isn't satisfied. And this time, there's no witch left to throw into the fire. All that's left is you, your son, who's slowly turning purple, and a leather sack of grain, now less than half full compared to yesterday. The strange thing is, you clearly remember last night. You carefully tied the sack, hung it off the ground, hid it behind old clothes, and told yourself to ration it into 3 parts for the next 3 days. But this morning, when you reached inside, you found only a handful of millet and a few white moldy scraps lying there like foam on a swamp. At first, you thought rats, but then you saw your brother's eyes that didn't deny, didn't explain, didn't beg. They just looked at you, steady, heavy, tired, and silent, like a confession that didn't need words. He sat there by the cold ash hearth, one hand clutching his stomach, the other propped on his knee, his face unchanged, except for a slight flush of blood from being somewhat full. You said nothing. You went to the back of the tent, checked the old blankets, then looked back at the grain sack, empty as a traitor's heart. You asked him, why? And he answered, calm as if recounting a dream, because I didn't want to die last night. That answer, so simple, so clear, so true, you couldn't be angry. But you couldn't forgive either, because the price of his extra night of life was the risk of losing your sons tomorrow. In this winter, everyone wants one more night, but no one's humane enough to die together. You sat down, pulled the dull knife from under the straw, not to threaten, just to keep it close, because now you didn't trust anyone. No more blood ties, no more bonds. Brothers, fathers, sons, neighbors, all were measured by how much grain they could take and how quiet they stayed after taking it. Your brother saw the knife, but didn't react. Maybe he was ready. Maybe he thought you'd kill him, but you didn't. Not then. You took the leather sack, tied it with a cord, tucked it inside your shirt. You scraped the sack's lining for leftover crumbs, sprinkled them into hot water, and gave it to your son. He didn't ask anything. He was used to not asking. You thought of childhood days, when you and your brother fought over corn porridge, stole bird eggs, and argued over burning them too much. You remembered him carrying you across a river when you had a fever. But those memories didn't keep the fire going. They didn't heat water. They didn't save your son. That night, you slept with the knife under your pillow, your back turned to your brother. The wind wasn't strong, but the tent felt like cold stone was melting layer by layer in your heart, colder from within than the snow outside. And then your brother coughed, a strange cough, half choked, half wet, like his throat was drowning in mud. You didn't turn around. You didn't ask, "Are you okay?" You just lay there, hand gripping the knife's handle, feeling each ragged breath behind you like a vague warning. Today it was grain. Tomorrow it could be firewood. The day after it could be you. The next morning, your brother didn't wake. His eyes were open, staring at the torn tent roof, where a cold streak of sunlight pierced through withered grass. No blood, no scream, just the wind passing through his mouth like it would an empty cave. He died quietly, like someone who was ready. No one buried him, no one cried. You covered him with a cloth, dragged him behind the tent, and left him with the other bodies. People would say he died of sickness, but you knew he died because he ate what wasn't his. And for one more night of life, he traded the last trust you had in family. You didn't resent him, but you didn't forgive. You just silently checked the grain sack. Still nothing more inside. No one returned what was taken, and winter returned no one. Your son burned with fever all day. You had to light a fire with scraps of wood from an old bed frame. You sat watching him, hand on his forehead, hearing his rapid breaths like a storm trapped in his small chest. Each gasp tightened your heart. You'd lost one family member. You couldn't bear to lose another. In his delirium, he called for his uncle. You didn't answer. You just pulled the blanket higher and whispered, "Your uncle won't take anything anymore," because now your brother was gone. The wind outside howled, snow piled thick, like punishment from a god too tired to forgive. But you still had your son, still had fire, still had a knife. And you knew, from now on, no one would eat your share. But you also knew the price of surviving today was carrying the shadow of a family member left beside a hearth you both once shared to keep warm. And you began to understand, survival wasn't just outlasting the cold, it was living with the memories of what you'd lost, the people, the scraps of love, and the part of you that once softened at the guilty eyes of someone who stole your grain. But softening didn't keep you alive. Night fell, the cold peeling layers of skin from your bones, and for the first time this winter, you didn't sleep alone. After your brother's death, 3 people asked to stay in your tent. A widowed woman with hands so cracked she couldn't light a fire, a gaunt teenager who hadn't spoken since winter began, and a child, unclear if boy or girl, who always looked at others with the eyes of someone who'd seen too many die. They had nothing to trade, just a plea to stay. And when the dead outnumber the living, refusing a walking corpse becomes harder than agreeing. You nodded. They entered. The tent, barely big enough for 3 to huddle, now cramped 4 people, 2 blankets, a weak ash-red fire, and a knife dulled from chopping bones for porridge. Your son fell asleep right after being wrapped in the warm blanket. The teenager sat by the door, back to the tent, as if wanting no part of anyone. The woman sat close to you, hands clasped, eyes unblinking. The child lay somewhere near your feet, stirring faintly with each gust of wind. No one spoke, no one asked names, no one asked what anyone brought, but they all saw the knife you placed beside you, handle toward you, blade half hidden in the straw, like a snake sleeping in the tent's heart. Because with 4 people, 2 blankets, 1 fire, and temperatures outside so low that piss froze to ice, no one trusted anyone. Every rustle was too loud. Every breath hissing in the night was a reminder. Someone's awake, someone's thinking, someone's planning. You didn't sleep. You just closed your eyes and listened to the fire crackling, the wind hitting the tent walls, the occasional shuffle of feet under stiff blankets. And you knew, tonight was longer than any night before. Not because of time, but because of the tension in the air. At midnight, you heard a soft sound, not loud, but enough to make you open your eyes. The woman had sat up. Her shadow flickered on the tent wall, trembling like a dying flame. She didn't move toward the fire. She moved toward the leather sack hanging by your head, the one where you'd hidden a few crumbs of dried bread, leftovers from the goat's leg you kept since killing Dara. You said nothing, but your hand rested on the knife's handle, lightly, like touching a memory. The woman stopped, didn't turn. She stood there, long enough to seem like she was listening to your thoughts. Then she returned to her spot, quietly, as quick as she'd moved. You didn't sigh in relief, because you knew the night was still long. Near dawn, the teenager coughed, not a normal cough, a phlegmy, choked cough that stopped abruptly, like a knife slashing a throat. You didn't turn, but you heard the child stir, rummaging through the blankets, maybe for a blanket, maybe for something else. You gripped the knife's handle, and you realized your hand no longer shook, not because you were brave, but because you'd lost feeling and trust. Dawn came with a grey fog thick as mud, the light barely enough to see faces, just enough to know who was still alive. The teenager still sat by the door, head tilted, You thought he was asleep, until you got closer and saw his purple face, eyes half open, and the scarf around his neck tightened one loop too far. You turned, looked at the child. It didn't cry, didn't deny, didn't speak. It just sat there, breathing lightly, as if it had just learned a lesson taught by winter itself. Those who sleep deeply, trust others, or don't guard their throats, die. You didn't question, didn't call the woman. You just dragged the body out of the tent, placed it near the tree, where the first child lay still, then went back, relit the fire. The woman avoided your eyes. The child dozed by the hearth. You didn't kick anyone out. You said nothing. But from that moment, the knife no longer stayed beside you. You tied it to your body, looped through your neck, the blade resting just below your sternum, because now, even in a tent full of people, you were alone. And the night in that tent, with 4 people, 2 blankets, 1 knife, and too many reasons to kill each other, was the only reminder that surviving was no longer luck. It was a choice to stay awake, to not trust, to not forget that tonight, people killed for a warmer breath. And tomorrow, when someone vanished, no one would question anymore, because in this winter, every disappearance had the most logical reason. They weren't strong enough to stay. But then, one night, as you sat guarding the fire with the knife tied tight to your chest, you heard footsteps, not the steps of a hungry person, nor the desperate shuffle you'd heard when someone trudged through snow to beg for fire. These were steady, slow, heavy, certain steps, like a large animal walking on 2 legs. You didn't move, just tilted your ear. Then the steps stopped right outside the tent. No knock, no call, no plea, just standing there, waiting. You didn't dare move. The woman by the wall froze. The child burrowed deep into the ash hearth, as if trying to dissolve into dust. Your son slept soundly, forehead sweaty, unaware of what stood 1 torn wall and 1 breath away. Then there was a rustle, like cloth, brushing cloth, like sheepskin whipped by wind, and you realized whatever was out there wore something, not the human hides villagers wore, but real sheepskin, whole, thick enough to block the wind. Then it left, as quietly as it came. No words, no breath. But from then on, your tent's fire shrank. The ashes didn't stay red long, and no matter how much wood you added from the back door, the flames seemed forced to die early. You told the woman. She wasn't surprised. She said, "It's him, the one in the sheepskin. He comes every year." You asked, "Who is he?" She replied, "No one knows. Some say he was a villager abandoned one winter. Some say he's a vengeful god. Some say he's winter's child, born from snow and cold ash. But one thing's certain, any tent he visits, the fire doesn't burn long anymore." You didn't believe her, but 3 days later, the tent beside yours, home to 3 children and a blind old man, went silent. When you checked, they were all dead, stiff as stone statues. The hearth still had ash. The wood was still piled, but the fire wouldn't burn. They weren't hungry. They weren't hurt. They just stopped living, and people started whispering, "He came again." In the nights that followed, in the wind, you sometimes heard the rustle of sheepskin, the unhurried steps, and felt something larger than darkness passing through your life, slow and patient like death. No one saw his face, but stories spread. If you accidentally met the eyes of the one in the sheepskin, you'd start feeling cold from within. Not ordinary cold, a cold that made you stop fearing, stop wanting, stop remembering, and one day you'd just sit there, quiet, like a tree in snow, until someone carried your body to the oak. Some said they saw him standing at the village's edge, in a blizzard, unmoving, just watching. Others swore he walked with a pack of white dogs, red-eyed, silent, and some said he didn't seek the hungry. He sought those growing used to winter, because those accustomed to despair were the easiest to invite death. You started drawing symbols at your tent's door, a crossed circle. What the old priest said was a no-entry mark for spirits. You scattered ash around, buried a piece of goat fur under the threshold, and each night you placed the knife on your chest, lying still as stone, waiting for the footsteps to pass. But then you realized the one in the sheepskin stopped coming to your tent. Though you heard him circling the village, your fire still burned, however small. Your son still breathed, however weak. The strange woman and child still rose each morning, though their eyes were sunken and lips cracked to bleeding, and you grew more afraid, because that could only mean 2 things. Either he forgot you, or he was already inside. You looked around the tent. The woman now slept more by day than night. The child no longer looked at you with human eyes, only at the hearth. Your son started muttering things in his sleep that weren't real. As if in the deepest cold, minds began to freeze too, and you started to wonder, what if you were the one in the sheepskin? Because you no longer feared death, no longer cried, no longer called names in your dreams. You just kept the fire, the knife, a trembling body beside people you weren't sure were human anymore. And you remembered your brother's last words. "I just didn't want to die last night." Maybe he said that too, before donning the sheepskin, before walking forever in the blizzard, before forgetting his name and becoming what everyone feared to name. And you understood, sometimes legends don't come from outside. They come from what dies inside you, without you noticing. And if one night you stood and walked through the village, draped in sheepskin, eyes unblinking, passing tents without leaving footprints, then maybe you'd cross to the other side, not because you were killed, but because you had no reason left to live. Until you heard a scream tear through the foggy morning and realized you still had one reason: your daughter was gone. No trace, no footprints, no final sound, just her old cloak draped over a branch at the village's edge by the black forest, where you'd told her 1,000 times not to go. But children born in frost don't listen like those raised in spring. They're born with an instinct to flee, a sense that somewhere beyond the grey ash and cold tents, there's a better place, or at least a quicker death. And she went. One morning you woke to an eerie quiet in the tent. No coughing, no stirring, no eyes waiting for watery porridge. You looked around. Only your son still slept. The strange child stared at the tent wall. The woman lay motionless, and she was gone. No goodbye, no sign, as if she melted into the wind. You didn't scream, you didn't shout, you just put on your coat, tucked the knife into your belt, and walked toward the forest. Because the last time you saw her eyes light up was when you told her about the white stag at the forest's edge, a creature the village believed was a good omen, but also a death omen, if chased. You walked like a sleepwalker, through snow deeper than your legs, through bushes hard as bones, through stone hollows where the wind wailed like moans. And then you saw nothing, just forest, bare forest, forest breathing cold and silent, like an open grave. But then there was a sign, a drag mark in the snow, not footsteps, like someone's small light was pulled, enough to leave a faint trail. You followed it to a large tree, split in two, and the trail vanished. No blood, no cloth, no other footprints. You searched frantically, called her name, but in the forest, your voice was swallowed. Only a distant echo remained, like the cry of a father now weeping for someone who'd vanished from this world. You returned to the village, feet purple, lips cracked to bleeding, and said nothing. The woman looked at you, didn't ask. The child looked at you, then turned away. Your son woke, confused. "Where's my sister?" You sat beside him, trembling, empty hands, unable to give an answer. That night, your tent was colder than usual, not from lack of wood, but from lack of a person. A small breath, a faint step, a thin laugh, gone. People started whispering. The forest took her. But the forest didn't take anyone. The forest just stood there. And something else in the forest was the taker. Some said they'd seen a tall, dark figure moving in the forest, draped in sheepskin like the legend, but not crossing into the village, just lurking at the edge, waiting for someone foolish to enter. Others said the forest had hidden paths, where the desperate went and never returned, where ice didn't melt but reshaped into bowed human statues. And a few those who'd lost children like you said their children weren't dead, just held as sacrifices for the winter god, so the rest could live another week, month, season. You believed none of it, but you didn't sleep. You sat all night by the hearth, eyes unblinking, hand on the knife, as if that could keep something else from slipping away. The next morning, someone left a bracelet of dried vines outside your tent, your daughter's, still intact. No blood, no burns, just damp with forest scent. No one claimed to have brought it. No one knew who found it, but it was there, like a message. She's gone, but not far. You kept the bracelet, hung it outside the tent, not as a symbol of mourning, but as a door left unclosed. Each night, you still looked toward the forest, listened, no longer called, no longer hoped, but waited, because the only thing keeping a person alive is having something to wait for. And sometimes, what you wait for isn't your child's return, but your own courage to enter the forest, to know if what took her was a god, a beast, a person, or just the part in each of us that lurks, silent, waiting for a moment of weakness to steal the last thing you haven't lost. And then, one by one, things were stolen, not with screams, not with blood, but with absences so small, so light, yet bone deep. You no longer heard cats in the village, no scratching on tent walls at dawn, no soft steps in the snow like warm ghost shadows, no hissing growls when rats scurried near the hearth. Cats, the last creatures that could make people smile faintly in a world that forgot light, were gone. One day, the strange child by the hearth whispered, "There's no one left to guard anymore." You asked, "Guard what?" It replied, "Cats guard dreams. Now no one watches." You didn't know who taught it those words, or if it understood what it said, but you knew. From the night the last cat didn't return, the village changed. Rats ate food faster, fires were harder to light, and people vanished more quietly. Before, when someone died, you found a body. Now you didn't. Just drag marks leading out of the village, or an odd-colored pile of ash at the snow's edge, or nothing but a torn blanket and a still warm hat. Cats didn't stop death, but they once kept death from entering without knocking. Now the door had no guard, and the nights grew longer. You started dreaming, not of old memories, but of things you'd never seen. A fire burning backward from the ground, your daughter sitting in the lap of someone in fur with no face, your son walking toward a pit filled with cat bones. You woke to the smell of untraceable roasted meat, eyes stinging as if you'd stared too long in the dream. And for the first time, your tent felt less like a shelter and more like a place slowly sealing shut. You went looking for cats, not to keep, just to believe there was still a creature that could walk between two worlds without melting into the cold. You went to every tent, asked every person. Most stayed silent. One old woman mumbled, "The last one I had to eat it. It meowed so softly, like it didn't want to bother." You didn't blame her. You said nothing, but from that moment, you knew the cats weren't all killed by the cold. They were eaten by the same people who once petted them, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of death. Cats didn't complain, didn't resist, they just looked. And when killed, maybe they still thought you were their friend. That's why you couldn't swallow the charred meat the strange child offered. You didn't ask where it came from. You just tossed it into the fire, watching the fat sizzle like claws scratching tent walls. From that day, you carried a cat bone, found near an old hearth, not as a charm, not to pray, but to remember that once the most innocent creatures were killed, none of us could be called good anymore. And you saw it clearly. The looks in the village changed too. No more pleading eyes, no more hatred, just empty stares, as if everyone was waiting their turn, like when you know there's only one door left to an abyss, and everyone must pass through, just not who goes first. That night, 3 knocks came at your tent. 3, slow, deliberate. No one answered. When you asked, "Who's there?" no one stood there when you opened the flap. But the next morning, the strange woman was gone. No blood, no trace, just a grey strand of hair clutched in the child's hand. It said, "She followed the cats." And you started to believe that maybe the cats led the last people away, not to escape death, but to avoid becoming something worse than death. You sat by your son, who no longer had a fever, but also didn't speak. He just sat, eyes like clouded mirrors, clutching his sister's bracelet. You told him the legend of the first cat, that it was once human, transformed to escape the world's first storm, that it roamed to remind people of the line between warmth and cold, life and wilderness. Your son didn't smile, but for the first time, he looked up toward the door, as if waiting for someone, maybe a cat, maybe his sister, maybe death, this time in a more familiar guise. But you also knew when the cats were gone, it meant people had eaten the last thing that would come back to lick their wounds. And from now on, when the scratching on tent walls stopped, you'd have to ask yourself, tonight, is the wind loud enough to mask the footsteps of someone walking away forever? But then, amid days when even breath turned to frost, a rumor slipped through the ice-sealed tent walls, through the frost and despair, on the eastern hilltop, where broken trees gave way to barren gravel, stood an old, abandoned temple. They said it was where ancestors once prayed for sun. Not rain, not crops, but sun. The golden light that could pierce flesh, dry wounds, warm the marrow, and remind people they weren't forgotten. That temple, long deserted, was avoided because someone once died at its door, eyes bleeding, screaming that the sun god forgot all humankind. But now, no one feared old curses, only the present cold. And when every hearth was dying, every knife dulled, every cat eaten, only one thing remained that everyone craved: hope, even the maddest kind. So you went, not because you believed, but because there were no other choices. You carried your son on your back, tied him with grass cords, tucked the last dry cloth against him, and began the trek through snow. The strange child followed, silent. It carried only a stick and a black stone. It called it Summer's Heart. You didn't ask. At this point, belief was the one thing that needed no proof. The hill wasn't far, but the snow was thick as walls, the wind shrieking like nails raking skin. Each step was a choice with no promise of return. But then you saw it, shattered tiles, leaning stone pillars, and a rotten wooden door still standing, as if waiting for someone across centuries. The temple was empty. No altar, no statues, just a round hollow in the dirt floor, where a fire once burned. And around it, scratches, as if countless people had knelt there, screaming, clawing at the earth to beg for a son that never came. You set your son down, wrapped him in an old sheepskin. He didn't wake, but he breathed. You and the strange child lit a fire in that hollow with the single stick. The black stone was placed in the center. The fire flared, not strong but enough to bathe the temple in red for a moment. The child whispered, "The sun has ears." You didn't laugh. You just knelt, pressed your forehead to the stone, and said, "If anyone still remembers light, please look at us." Outside, snow still fell, but inside the temple, the wind stopped, a strange stillness, as if the air held its breath with you. Then you fell asleep, for the first time in many nights, without dreaming of death. When you woke, it wasn't yet dawn, but the snow had stopped. The wind no longer howled. The sky was grey, but clear grey, not the thick murk of weeks past. You lifted your son, his face flushed pink, his forehead cooled. He opened his eyes, softly asking, "Father, is this home?" You didn't answer. You just held him tight, feeling for the first time that the air in your chest wasn't frozen. The strange child stepped out of the temple, staring at the sky. It said nothing, but you saw its lips move. Maybe the sun's name. Maybe the name of someone who died in an old dream. Maybe its own name, something you never asked. On the way back to the village, you saw other footprints. Others had gone to the temple, and hope, like a reverse plague, had begun to spread. When you entered the village, no one asked anything, but everyone looked at the sky. An old man nodded. A young woman pulled out a cloth, wiped ash from her child's forehead. A man stood still, holding a stick, as if ready to rebuild a hearth. The temple didn't bring sun, but it brought something stronger, a reason to wait. And when your son stood that afternoon, lighting a small fire with his left hand, the tent glowed, not from light, but because for the first time someone dared to kindle something beyond fire to keep living. You still didn't know if any god heard your plea, but you knew the temple was no longer abandoned. As long as people dared to go there, as long as they were weak enough to need hope, it remained sacred. And maybe, just maybe, the sun stirred a little in its long sleep. It just hadn't opened its eyes yet, but it seemed people had. Because after returning from the temple, though the sky stayed grey, the wind cold, and food still just ash mixed with snow, a mad idea began to whisper among the survivors, to hold one last winter feast, not to celebrate, not to defy the gods, but to remember they were once human, that they once shared bread, clinked cups, laughed before winter swallowed every memory. So they gathered all that remained, a mouldy strip of dried meat, a few rotten turnips, some hardened fat, a handful of fragrant herbs left from last harvest's festival, and oddly, a bottle of fermented honey. No one remembered hiding. They agreed to meet in the village center, where the forge once stood, now a barren patch covered in ash, to light one final fire together. You didn't know if you should go. Since losing your daughter and burying your brother without words, you'd grown unaccustomed to laughter, but your son was different. He tugged your hand. "I want to hear music," he said, and you remembered there was a man in the village who played a stringed instrument, still alive, but with a broken hand. He sat among the crowd, hand bandaged, resting the instrument on his lap, like rekindling something nameless. When you arrived, light snow began to fall, not cold, not cutting, just drifting quietly like ash. Someone sang, someone told stories, someone poured honey wine onto the fire like an offering. But the strange thing was, no one ate. All the food was placed around the fire. No one touched it. No one reached. You ask someone, why?
You see?
They answered, this isn't for us. It's for those who've gone. And you understood this was the last feast. A farewell ritual without words, without tears, just fire and portions for shadows long gone from the tents. You watched your son sit quietly, eyes gleaming in the firelight. You saw him nod to someone across the hearth, where no one sat. You didn't ask, because in that moment, you felt someone standing behind you. Maybe your brother, maybe your daughter, maybe the part of you that died weeks ago. But they were silent, and you let them stay, at least for tonight. When the fire died, people left one by one. No one took the food. They left it all. Meat, turnips, honey, salt, for the wind, as if hoping winter, if it was a being that ate, would be satisfied and retreat. You and your son were the last to stay. You added a pinch of ash from your pocket to the fire, whispering, for those we didn't get to say goodbye to. Then you led your son home. The next morning, the ash patch was empty. No meat, no herbs, no honey bottle. Some said wild dogs took it. Others said the gods accepted it. But you knew that feast no longer belonged to your world. And strangely, from that day, the sky grew less grey. No sun, but light. No warmth, but not piercing cold. And the wind, for the first time in months, blew like a tired breath. No longer a blade carving flesh. You understood that feast was a declaration to winter, that we don't die quietly, that we can face the darkness and still share food, leave empty seats, reserve places by the fire for those we've lost. And if that wasn't enough to banish the snow, it was enough to remind you that some things, even death, couldn't swallow whole, like kindness, memory, and a final feast for names, whispered in the night. But just when people thought they'd exhausted every madness, something stranger emerged. It started with a child. It dreamed of a giant hearth somewhere underground, so deep no snow could reach, a glowing red place, full of light, where the dead weren't truly dead, but gathered together, laughing, eating, waiting for loved ones to join them. The child told its mother, the mother told a neighbor. By the next day, 3 others said they'd dreamed the same. A vast cellar like a great room, walls of honeycomb stone, etched with handprints. Fire burned from natural cracks, needing no wood. And there the missing your daughter, the strange woman, your brother, appeared, healthy, hair clean, clothes warm, eyes bright, inviting you in. You weren't immune to the plague. A few nights later, you dreamed too. In the dream, you passed through a narrow door, slid down a glowing ember-lit slope, and reached a place so warm you cried, not from emotion, but because your skin softened again. You saw yourself shed the sheepskin, set the knife aside, sit on a hot stone slab, and hold a steaming bowl of turnip soup handed by your mother. She was alive in the dream, and she smiled, a smile you hadn't seen since you were 10. When you woke, tears were still on your cheeks. Your son whispered, I dreamed it too. The village shook. No one said it, but everyone started digging like mad. Behind tents, under trees, in old barns, by ash hearths, beneath the temple floor. They needed no guide. They just needed to believe. And that belief spread faster than any faith before it. You grabbed a shovel, notched, just a broken piece of wood, and began digging. Snow was scooped like flesh. Your hands bled, but you didn't stop. No one stopped. Each hole was a potential door, each scoop a prayer. Please let it be here. But the earth didn't open, only wind. Wind howled, tired, as if asking, what are you doing? An old blind man who navigated by stick suddenly shouted, I smell fire under my feet. People rushed over, dug to the bone, but found only stone. Cold, hard, unfeeling. The old man died 3 days later. No one buried him. They feared covering the path to the hearth. Then a woman threw herself into a well, hoping the entrance lies underwater. No one dared retrieve her body. They feared she was the only one who reached that place. It was as if the village caught a shared delirium, No one could explain why they dreamed the same dream, described the same scene, remembered the same smell of turnip soup never cooked. But no one wanted to explain. They were too tired to doubt, too cold to stay sane, too broken to not believe in a glowing cellar where their loved ones waited. You began to wonder if the dream was real. Was death not loss, but just moving to another room, a lower floor, a warmer place, a place winter couldn't find? Your son asked, "Father, can we go find that cellar?" You answered, "When the snow stops." But in your heart you knew, if you could, you'd dig with your teeth, tear earth with your nails, just to know it was real, or even if it wasn't, just that it was a place everyone looked to, imagined, hoped for, was enough to keep people alive. One more day, one more night, one more dream. And so from that night, every dream was shared like a new scripture. People asked each other, "What did you see last night? Was anyone in sheepskin in your dream? Did the fire have a voice? Was your child near the hearth? Who cooked the soup?" And whatever the answer, it was received with absolute reverence, as if truth no longer lay on the surface, but below, under ice, under stone, under memory, under something, that if you dug deep enough, you might touch a glowing truth, needing no proof, that winter wouldn't win forever, and the hearth was still burning. You didn't know if you'd ever find the entrance, but every night, before sleep, you held the small stone, the one the strange child called Summer's heart, placed it under your pillow, and closed your eyes, waiting for the fire to welcome you home. The dream fire didn't fill empty stomachs, and when dreams of the underground hearth became faith's last refuge, reality rose like a wound that wouldn't close. That day, the man in the next tent died. No one cried, no one approached, but everyone knew so well. No one needed to see the body, just smell it. The smell of cooked flesh, not charred, not ash, but like feasts of old, melting fat, crackling skin, meat softening under heat. You turned away, afraid to breathe deeply, but you didn't step outside, because stepping out meant seeing, and seeing meant no pretending you didn't. And once you saw, there was no going back. The body vanished the next night. They said wild dogs took it. But wild dogs don't clean blood, don't wrap meat in goatskin, don't divide portions so evenly. You started noticing something changed in people's eyes. Not hatred, not despair, but hunger, pure hunger. Hunger so raw that every glance held a quick calculation. How much meat on that body? Is that skin thick? Are those tendons tough or tender? Children were no longer carried, elders no longer helped. The weak, the slow, the deep sleepers became possibilities. And one morning, you caught the strange child standing by your son, holding a large rock, staring at his neck with eyes no longer human. You didn't shout. You walked over, took the rock, pushed the child away, and said, "If you want to eat, I'll cook for you." It didn't speak, didn't cry, just looked at you, as if you'd stolen the dessert it dreamed of all week. That night, you locked the tent from inside. For the first time all winter, you set traps around your sleeping spot. The knife was hidden in the blanket. Your son slept in your arms, unaware, but you didn't close your eyes, and you realized everyone was doing the same. The village became a web of taut traps. Under the snow, the frantic heartbeat of cornered animals. People stopped talking, not because there was nothing to say, but because speaking made teeth chatter. And if teeth chattered, others knew you were weak. And if you were weak, you were seen as meat. That look, piercing through clothes, through eyes into your core, was worse than the cold. It didn't chill, it burned slowly, like a hearth, not in dreams. You remembered the season's start, when the village sat together to share wood, when someone sang, when hands held hands. Now those hands were knives, those eyes saws, and human hearts, the stuff of community, had become seasoning. You started counting. How many in this tent? How many gone from that one? The numbers dwindled, but the smell of cooked meat grew. One night, smoke rose from the western tent, once home to 3 children, now just 1. But the smell of roasting meat was so strong even snow couldn't hide it. You carried your son to an old stone storage tent. Narrow door, no one would think to sleep there. But cold was better than being eaten. The strange child didn't follow. It stayed. Maybe it no longer dreamed, or dreamed of something else. In the stone tent, you and your son huddled under one hide. You told him about summer, not real. You made up a field, a stream, a school of leaping fish, an apple tree that never ran out of fruit. He asked, "Are there cats?" You said yes, hundreds, and no one eats them. He smiled, the first in weeks, but then fell asleep in your arms, sweat beading like frost on his forehead. You heard footsteps outside, soft, quiet, then scratching on stone, as if someone smelled you were still alive. You held your breath. The knife stayed between your chests. You knew tonight no one was human. Everyone was meat, or hunting meat, and you began to understand winter didn't need to kill. It just stood there and let the living see each other as food. When that happened, winter won, not from cold, but because we chose to live by eating each other. And to live one more day, you changed too. Not outside, not the cracked skin or sunken eyes from sleeplessness, but inside, something soft, hardened. Something once horrific became simple. Like killing, you didn't kill from anger, not from hate, but for a turnip. A real turnip, sprouting at the temple's edge, where gravel and human waste mixed in mud. You didn't know how it grew. No one dared pick it. They believed anything growing in winter belonged to the gods. Touch it, and you'd be punished. But you no longer believed in gods. You only saw the turnip, poking from the earth like an inviting finger, pale, trembling, but alive. And alive was the only thing worth taking.
Whoa.
You watched it 3 nights. The first, only wind. The second, footprints. The third, you saw him. The man who once sharpened scythes, now skin over bones, hands shaking as he clutched the turnip like a newborn. He smiled, teeth mostly gone, and the moment he sat, broke the turnip in half and brought one piece to his mouth. You stepped behind him, softly. Your knife wasn't sharp, but his neck was soft. You stabbed once, gripped tight, pulled right, then covered his mouth like you did for your son during nightmares. No blood sprayed, no scream, just a gust of wind through his coat's gap. He fell like an empty sack. The turnip rolled free. You picked it up, tossed the bitten half, ate the untouched part. Raw, sweeter than anything you'd ever tasted. Your eyes watered, unsure if from the sweetness or crossing a line you couldn't return from. You left his body, didn't bury, didn't hide, just sprinkled dirt on his face like tucking in someone asleep. You felt no guilt, only lightness, like a full stomach giving reason to exist again. You brought the turnip's leaves to your son. He ate, eyes brightening, no questions, no need, because he knew no meal this winter was clean. From then, you learned to kill without sound, without rumors, without witnesses. Those who walked alone toward the forest, those who slept too deeply by hearths, those who let a bony leg slip from a blanket, all were opportunities, not for eating, but for taking what they had, a crumb of dried bread, a bit of fat wrapped in hide, a handful of wood buried under dirt, sometimes just an intact cord, but you took it all, not from greed, but from knowing those who don't take, lose. You taught your son silence, to eat without noise, to sleep without stirring, to freeze when hearing steps. You taught him to tell hunting footsteps from dying ones, to hold a knife with both hands if they shook. You were no longer a father, you were a pack leader, and he was a cub. One morning your son asked, "If you die, can I take your share?" You laughed, not sad, not angry, just nodded. If you survive, anything you do is right. And in his eyes, you saw yourself reflected, a smaller, hungrier, faster, colder version. One day, you returned to the tent and saw an odd mark on the wall, a shallow, even knife slash, shoulder height. Someone had entered, took nothing, but left a message, not a warning, an understanding, that you were no longer invisible, that others were doing as you did. And now, the village was a slaughterhouse. No screams, no blood needed, just someone who slept, hesitated, softened. You didn't hesitate, you didn't soften, you didn't sleep, and you didn't kill more than necessary, only when hungry, only when needed, only when a turnip grew in the wrong place. Winter taught you, killing wasn't evil, killing was economy, calculation, resource allocation. The only way to stay human shape, even when everyone saw each other as meat. And that night, you dreamed you became a shadow. No form, no sound, just a knife moving through snow, light as breath, quick as the first wind signaling a summer that never came. But even wind stops sometimes, and fire, supposedly extinct weeks ago, returned one night, not in a hearth, not in a dream, but roaring from a tent at the village's edge. Flames reached the treetops, licking the grey sky, red as old blood boiled. People gathered to watch, not to save, not to fetch water, just standing like smoke statues, witnessing something incomprehensible. A child, no older than 12, had set its own tent ablaze, not from cold, not from attack, but because it said it wanted to find the light again. It shouted through the crackling wood, "I want to see the sun one last time." Its mother screamed, stomping barefoot in snow, trying to rush into the flames, but held back by two people. No one stopped the fire, only the mother. Maybe because everyone knew you can't pull light from darkness if the darkness is already inside. The child stood in the tent, hair singed, holding a burning stick, eyes wide to tearing, as if seeing a sun no one else remembered. And then, it stopped shouting, stopped screaming, stopped struggling. It just stood still until it collapsed with the tent's falling roof, like a final shooting star dropping from the sky. When the fire died, no one looked for a body, no one approached the ashes. The mother sat steps away, clutching her head, rocking endlessly. One man said, "It was mad." Another whispered, "It was called back." But in everyone's heart, they knew the child wasn't mad. It was braver than all. It refused to wait, refused to die bit by bit. It chose to die once, and in fire, something people forgot could warm hearts. After that night, no one lit fires in the village. Despite wood, despite reasons, despite someone dying, because that fire became too strong a symbol, not of hope, but of failure, that a child had to burn itself to hope for light. You sat in the stone tent, watching your son sleep, his small hand clutching your coat, and wondered, had he ever thought like that? Had he ever wished to die quickly? Had he ever looked out, seen the endless white cold, and secretly wished for a blaze to take him? You didn't ask. You feared the answer. But from that day, you kept the knife farther from his reach. Not from suspicion, but because if one day he wanted to burn the tent, you'd at least know first. And then, one morning, you saw the strange child, the one who lived with you weeks ago, who held a rock behind your son's head, sitting by the burned tent's ashes, unmoving, as if waiting for something to rise from the dust. You didn't approach, but you understood the light that child spoke of might not be in the sun, but in memory, in stories, in what once made people feel warm. And when all that was gone, maybe burning yourself was the last way to reclaim a spark from death's hands. That night, you saw your son dream, lips moving, then crying, the first time in weeks. You didn't wake him, you just held him tight, whispering, "You don't need to burn anything. I'm still here, and my hands are still warm enough for you." But in your heart, a question lingered. If one day your hands weren't warm anymore, would your son be the next to choose a light no one could name? You didn't know, but the next morning when your son asked, "Father, are we hungry again today?" you realized he no longer hoped to be full. He just needed to know how today's hunger differed from yesterday's. And you saw it wasn't just him. Every child left in the village, tiny faces without tears, purple lips murmuring untaught lullabies, eyes looking through adults like they were ghosts. The children no longer played, no longer cried, no longer asked why. They just nodded, walked slowly, and learned to share the wind. Winter was no longer weather. It had become doctrine, a faith harsher than any religion. Lesson 1, sleep when hungry to think less of your stomach. Lesson 2, don't trust anyone tapping your shoulder at night. Lesson 3, save your mouth, your feet, your breath for what truly matters. No one taught these lessons, but every child learned, because those who didn't were dead. Adults whispered of killing, eating flesh, digging holes underground, but children silently accepted. They didn't demand milk, didn't complain of cold, didn't ask, "When will summer come?" They knew better than adults. This winter had no after. Winter was forever, and surviving wasn't about reaching spring, but about not becoming someone else's meal today. Passing the temple one day, you saw 3 children bowing before the cracked stone floor. not praying, just silent. One slumped forward, bit its lip until it bled, then licked the blood like a rare dish. The other two didn't flinch. They nodded, as if confirming, "You're still alive." That was the new ritual. No gods, no words, just proof. This one, today, isn't meat yet. Your son was the same. He didn't play, but he watched. He looked outside more, counted footsteps, memorized faces. Every morning, he asked, "How many were in the left tent yesterday? How many today?" Answer right. He nodded, relieved. Answer wrong. He didn't sleep. You understood he was training his memory to survive. You saw him hide a sharp stone in his sleeve. You didn't take it, because you knew, if you didn't return one day, that stone would be his only reason not to vanish in smoke like other children. One morning, your son asked, "Does Winter hate children?" You answered, "No, but Winter doesn't know what children are." And he nodded, as if he understood. You didn't need to say more. Because here, where waking each morning was a miracle, and every meal a bargain with darkness, children were no longer children. They were creatures learning to die slowest. And that was part of the doctrine. At night, you heard murmurs like chants, not from adults, from children. They made their own hymn. Not dead today, not cold today, not meat today, not crying today. Today is today. They whispered it like a code. Each time you heard it, your heart tightened, not from pity, but from awe. Never in your life did you think you'd bow to a child, but now you knew they were the true priests of winter. No pomp, no robes, no sermons, just bare feet on snow, trembling hands clinging to life, and eyes unafraid of the dark. And you knew, if you fell one day, your son would sit by your body, murmuring, "Yesterday, Father was alive. Today, Father is fire." No crying, no calling your name, just remembering and continuing. Because that was the only thing Winter's doctrine demanded. Live long enough to need no one else. And then someone went beyond that doctrine. He didn't recite hymns, didn't whisper prayers, didn't murmur the chant of "not dead today." He simply dug a deep ice pit, stripped off his clothes, hugged himself, and asked two others to bury him alive in snow. There was no madness in his eyes, just one reason. Deep in the earth, there's no wind. People didn't understand. They stood and watched. No one laughed. No one stopped him, because everyone knew any method that let you survive one more day deserved a try. He said, "Wind killed faster than cold." Wind slipped through every gap in clothing, into ears, mouths, hearts, but earth was solid. Snow was heavy. If buried just deep enough, the body could hold its last heat instead of losing it through skin. The first person who heard laughed. The second tried it. A small man, limbs purple, trembling endlessly, asked you to help bury him in a snow pit by a fallen tree. You didn't want to, but he grabbed your hand, whispering, "I don't want to freeze to death. I want to sleep warm." And you helped. Not fast, not slow. You covered him with handfuls of snow, like wrapping him in a final blanket. When only his nose remained, he said softly, "If I don't wake tomorrow, don't cry. I chose this." Then you buried the rest. That night, you sat by the ice pit, didn't move an inch, as if witnessing a test of life, as if guarding a buried hearth. And then dawn came. No sun, but less wind. You brushed the snow aside, bit by bit, and saw his fingers twitch. He opened his eyes, not clouded, wet, breath weak, but steady. And he smiled, lips cracked, bleeding, but still a smile. "I'm alive," he whispered. "I slept, but not cold." People pulled him out. No one believed, but everyone watched. And that afternoon, 3 more ice pits were dug around the village. People began burying each other in shifts. Each pit had a watcher, not for death, but for life. Those who woke after a night were victors, and slowly, people understood. Winter didn't just attack from outside, but burned you from within, with fear. But when you learned to trust the earth's weight, the snow's density, the ability to sleep deeper than wind, you stole back a piece of control, as if telling Winter, "You're not the only one who can cover." Her eyes closed, like sleeping. When found, she was still alive, the wound shallow, but her cheek flushed. And from that day, she lived 4 more days. No shaking, no crying, no begging, but silent, as if those 4 days were a reward for daring to burn her own blood. And then it spread. In the tents of the weakest, you began seeing strange marks, small blood stains by chests, neat cuts on arms, wooden spoons dark with iron. No one spoke, but everyone knew. Blood was no longer something to hide. Blood became embers. People didn't cut to die, but to live longer. Even if just hours, even if just enough to stop shivering. You began to fear, not them, but yourself. Because you'd thought it too. If tomorrow's colder than today, if the snow pit isn't deep enough, if there's nothing left to burn, would you be sane enough not to drag a blade across your arm? You looked at your son, his lips purple again, back curled like a shell, skin cold as stone, and knew if one day he said, "Father, cut me, I'm too cold," you wouldn't say no. You'd ask, where hurts least, and you'd do it. Because now you understood clearer than ever. Warmth didn't need to come from outside. It could rise from blood, from organs, from what was once inside. And so, winter didn't need fire to live. It just needed the living to burn themselves. That night, you sat close to your son, heated the knife on a stone hearth, then pressed it to your back, not cutting, just to feel warmth spread from metal. Your son asked, "Does it hurt, father?" You said, "No, this is how I remember feeling alive." And he nodded, didn't ask more, but as you dozed, in your dream, you saw his hand sneak the knife from the stone, press it to his chest, not hard, just light, like a cold kiss from survival itself. In the morning, you saw a red mark on his chest, no blood, but not a dream's mark either. You held him, didn't cry, didn't yell, just whispered, "Don't burn yourself for me. If it comes to it, I'll burn first." And from then, every night, you hid the knife. Not because you feared he'd do wrong, but because you feared one day you'd hand it to him yourself and call it love. Because now, blood warmed skin, and that was no longer a metaphor. But then, one night, when all seemed sunk deep into the doctrine of pain and silence, a man stepped into the village center, unarmed, bare-chested, eyes wide, like they glowed, and declared something no one expected. He'd spoken to the moon, not in a dream, not in prayer, but truly, as one person to another. He said, on a night too cold to sleep and too hungry to dream, he sat alone on the village's highest mound, staring at the full moon like a white scar in the black sky, and cried out, "If you see me, answer." And the moon answered, not in words, but in thoughts, in images flooding his mind like waves, a blazing fire, a long table, brimming wine, roasting meat, hands touching hands, mouths laughing loud. He didn't sleep, but in the morning, his stomach was full, cheeks flushed, hair soft as if washed. He told everyone, no one believed, but no one dared laugh. Because he stood there, in skin-cutting cold, unshivering, eyes bright, lips red, he said, "The moon is winter's grandmother. She hates no one. You just need someone to listen." And from then, every night, he went to the mound, sat for hours, whispering to the moon. Sometimes he cried, sometimes he laughed. Once, he shouted, "I forgive you," and collapsed as if absolved. The village grew uneasy. Some said he was mad, others whispered, "What if he touched something we missed?" A child followed him secretly, and the next morning returned saying, "I saw him sleep on snow and not die, still warm." The rumor spread fast. Then a second person tried, didn't speak, just stared at the moon. And that night, she dreamed of holding her lost daughter's hand in an old kitchen, smelling hot porridge and hearing a cat meow at the door. In the morning, she cried, not from sadness, but from memory. Then a third, fourth, fifth. Each night, the village emptied below, but dotted with figures sitting high, faces turned to the sky, like silent praying statues. You didn't plan to follow, but one evening, your son asked, "Does the moon know my name?" And you couldn't answer, so you led him to the mound. No words, no promises, just sat together. Wind blew, moon hung, no one answered. But in that silence, you saw your son's chest stop heaving from cold, his eyes closed without wincing, and you saw, maybe, the moon didn't truly speak. But when people looked at something greater than pain, they became smaller, and being smaller made them easier to forgive. You didn't dream that night, but in the morning, you saw a faint red mark on your son's forehead, like a kiss left behind, and you asked no more. So, each night, more went to the mound. No one cut their skin anymore. No one buried themselves. No one heated knives. They just looked at the moon, and the moon stayed there, neither closer nor gone. And that was enough, because sometimes survival didn't need miracles, just something unchanging to pour hope into, even a distant light you couldn't touch. And in that silence, the village began to breathe evenly again. No one was full, no one was safe, but everyone had a reason to lift their head, and lifting your head was the first thing the dead couldn't do. But surviving this winter wasn't about strength or cleverness, but the subtlest game of survival, a game whose only rule was passed through glances and held breaths. Whoever has a blanket lives. The blanket, a tattered goatskin worth more than the last meal, became the village's new symbol of power. No kings, no leaders, no laws, but the blanket, and what it brought, warmth. You'd seen people fight over blanket scraps, like they were fighting for life itself. You'd seen a child, no older than 8, clutch a worn blanket, refusing to share with an elder, even for a minute. You knew keeping a blanket wasn't just keeping warm, but keeping the right to breathe, to sleep, to exist. Each blanket was a small fortress, a locked door against hunger and cold. Those with blankets slept. Those without curled up, hands on stomachs, eyes staring into darkness, dreaming of a tomorrow that might never come. Elders hid blankets under straw, careful no one knew. Young ones traded blankets in the dark, in feverish delirium, like passing a promise to survive. You saw yourself become the blanket keeper, deciding who was lucky enough to wrap in it at night, not because you wanted to, but because no one else could. You remembered one night, hearing an argument outside the tent, an old man refusing to share his blanket with a child, saying, "I've lived enough, it's not your turn." The child replied, "If you don't give me the blanket, I'll take it." And you knew, in this winter, words were the most useless thing. The only things that mattered were hands and knives. The next morning, the old man was gone. No one asked, no one looked. You didn't know if the child did it, but everyone understood. A blanket didn't just keep warmth, it kept life. And from then, the survival game wasn't just about taking food or water, but guarding your blanket. You taught your son how to hold the blanket when sleeping, how to bite his lip to not moan in cold, how to hide his shivers from others' eyes. You taught him to lie still, breathe lightly, not move, so the blanket wouldn't be noticed. You looked at him, small eyes full of experience, and saw the only child in the village who knew, in this winter, a blanket was the only ally, an invisible shield against death. Once you found your son curled in a torn blanket stolen from another, you didn't scold. You quietly took it back, then watched until he woke. You knew, in this winter, kindness was a luxury, and when people were kind, they gave away part of their warmth, part of their life. You learned to refuse hurried pleas, to harden when someone asked for a blanket, to look them in the eye and say no. You knew no one would remember you for cruelty, but winter would remember you for weakness. You weren't the strongest, but you had a blanket, and that was everything. One night, as you kindled a small fire, you heard soft footsteps outside. You gripped the knife, hand trembling, but eyes fixed on the door. A strange child, gaunt, hair matted, bare-chested, stood there, shivering, begging for a blanket. You looked at him long, then put the knife down, pulled out a thin cloth, gave it to him. The child nodded, clutched it like finding the last light. You looked at your son sleeping beside you, and realized this game had no final winner. Whoever had a blanket lived, whoever didn't, died, nothing else. And in your heart, you prayed your son would keep that blanket, no matter how brutal winter became, because with a blanket, there was life, there was hope, and with hope, you could take one more step through the night. But then, one day, you realized something colder than the winter covering the village. No one was dying anymore, not because everyone was stronger, but because there was no one left to die. Empty tents, blankets, without owners, knives, gathering dust on walls, bodies no one found, all reminded you that death had finished its task. The survivors countable on fingers, or maybe just shadows of people, lived not by breath, but by humanity's last instinct to exist. You stood in the village, steps silent, glances wordless, realizing the stillness was heavier than any skin-cutting wind before. No crying, no moaning, just oppressive silence, as if the village forgot how to die. And in that forgetting, you felt lost. The strange woman had long vanished, the strange child now just a shape. Your son spoke less each day, and you were still awake, still watching. No one wanted to think it, no one wanted to say it, but no one could deny it when no one died anymore. The living became the last ones left, the loneliest in the world. One night, you sat by a weak fire, saw your son stare at the starry sky, eyes full of questions and vague fear. He asked, "If no one dies anymore, what are we living for?" You didn't answer, because you didn't know. You just looked at the fire, watching it flicker, tremble, as if trying to prolong life for a world dead in its heart. And you understood, when no one died, it wasn't life's victory, but the harshest weight, waiting for inevitable extinction, waiting for the day you'd lack strength to stand. And in that wait, you held your son's hand, whispering, "We're alive, and whatever that means, it's a miracle." But you knew that miracle was frailer than ever, because when no one died, it wasn't winter's end, but winter's win, through ruthless patience, through wordless heart-rending cold. You looked around, saw darkness cover every roof, every glance, and you wondered, did anyone still remember summer light, life, when only you and your son remained, in a world without the call of the departed? And then, one day, when the sun finally slipped through barren trees, when snow began melting on tattered thatch roofs, when the earth's warmth seeped into tiny blades of grass, you knew spring had come, but no one was left to notice. The village stood silent, like a faded watercolor, only empty shadows lingering on mossy stone steps. You and your son walked through muddy paths, once filled with laughter, song, now just the drip of melting water from roofs. Doors once wide open to welcome you were now shut, their wooden arms rotted, lying still on the ground. You carried your son past empty tents, no signs of life, no children's cries, no traces of familiar faces. Your son looked around, eyes wide, asking, "Father, why is no one here?" You stayed silent, because you knew the answer wasn't in words, but in each touch of sunlight on skin, each faint warmth breathed into the breeze. Spring came, bringing new life, but also loss, nothing could replace. You remembered meals, shared around hearths, sighs, final hand clasps, and you realized, in this spring, you didn't just walk through winter's weather, but through the winter of souls that had gone. Your son tugged your hand, pointing to a great oak, where you'd buried thousands of tiny hopes under thick snow. Now it was just a bare trunk, broken branches around it like scattered memories. You held him, saying, "Spring is for starting again." But sometimes, starting again is a solitary thing. You didn't know if this spring was truly rebirth, or just a step on the final road of loneliness. But you knew, whatever it was, you had to keep walking, for your son, for wordless dreams, for the fragile life you couldn't abandon. And as you passed through the village, seeing empty roofs, hearing birds return after the long winter, you wondered, was someone out there, looking toward you, remembering what was lost, waiting for the day to meet again. Spring came, not to save the departed, but to remind the living that, even when no one was left to notice, life still needed preserving, minute by minute, breath by breath, day by day. And amid the ruins of a newborn spring, you saw your son was no longer the eager boy who once ran around hearths. He'd grown quiet, his eyes no longer holding childish light, but a deep void like a starless night. He didn't remember his name anymore. No one knew if he did, because he didn't say, only lived through sounds and sensations. The only thing he still recognized was the sound of fire, the crackling, the falling embers in the hearth. That was the only call, keeping him tied to the present, to life. You sat beside him in the dark, holding his freezing hand, listening to the fire. He whispered, not in words, but in breaths and slight nods, as if fire was the only language he could still speak. You told him old stories, of distant summers, warm meals, cats leaping on floors, but he only looked at you, eyes flickering briefly, then sliding back to silent emptiness. You knew memories were buried under snow, as thick as the village paths now, and the fire, though small, was the only thread linking two worlds, past and present, life and death, human and ghost. Each night, you kindled the fire, and your son sat beside, keeping it burning, not big, not small, just enough to chase a bit of cold from the tense heart. Sometimes, you heard him hum an old tune, one you'd long forgotten, but it came soft, faint, as if afraid to disrupt the fragile safety. You kept him close, day by day, hour by hour, like holding the last piece of a lost world. And you wondered, could fire preserve everything? Preserve memories, names, dreams, or would fire, in the end, die too in a night? no one woke from. You didn't know, but one thing was certain: whether your son forgot his name or not, the sound of fire would always be the guiding lamp for those left in the dark, and you'd never let go of it. But life was sometimes heavier than death, especially when you realized you lived by eating those you loved. That night, as the hearth faded, you sat beside your son, staring at the small bones left in the old pot. The meat was gone, only murky broth, and a sickly smell rising in the smoke. Your son whimpered in his sleep, and you recalled the last time you heard his mother's laugh, the last time your brother sat shoulder to shoulder with you, the last time the strange child held your hand and said words no one remembered. You knew, in that moment, life and death had merged, and you'd traded kindness, forgiveness, humanity to keep this breath. You ate, not because you wanted to, but because you had to, because your stomach was empty so long it no longer distinguished blood from tears, hope from despair. You ate because there was no choice. You ate because you knew, if you didn't, your son would die too. The small bones, the dried meat scraps, each gulp of broth were parts of someone you once loved, and no matter how you tormented yourself, that was the only truth keeping you alive. That night, you didn't cry, you didn't pray, you just sat, silent, letting the fire warm what remained of your soul. Your son woke in the night, eyes bleary, and you whispered, "Everything I've done is for you." He didn't reply, but you felt forgiveness, or at least a silent understanding, because in this winter, love was no longer hugs, lullabies, or gifts. It was survival, choices, with no alternatives. You wondered what you'd become if one day your son had to eat human flesh to survive. Would he forgive you? Would he keep the fire in his heart, or become darkness, like so many lost? You knew the answer wasn't easy, but you knew whatever happened, you and your son had crossed a threshold no one wanted to open. Your meals were no longer just food. They were existence in every bite of flesh, every drop of blood, every last breath of loved ones. And when dawn pierced the tense gap, you looked at your son, silently vowing to keep that life for another tomorrow. A tomorrow where you wouldn't have to eat those you loved to survive. But until then, you only knew to live, eat, and love the way winter taught you, a way no one wanted, but couldn't avoid. And then, as the sun rose over frozen fields, the village's survivors returned to the fields, not with joy, not with hope, but with a deep exhaustion etched in every step. They plowed the earth, but no laughter, no friendly words like seasons past. Each person moved like a dragging ghost, faces pale, eyes without life's light, reflecting only what was lost: family, friends, the smallest but most precious things. Rough hands no longer clasped to help, only gripped plow handles to avoid collapsing in the cold wasteland. You watched your son walk beside you, silent. He didn't smile. His eyes quietly followed the sun, perhaps only because its light couldn't pierce the darkness in his heart. You realized winter hadn't just taken health, food, warmth. It took joy, laughter, the happy memories people once prided themselves on. Those returning to the fields today weren't the ones who once lived there. They were shadows of themselves, trying to prolong life with weary steps, with hands stiffened by cold, but still, they went, still plowed, because that was the last task left, the only way to prove they were still human, if only in appearance. You looked to the horizon, where light gently touched the treetops, and wondered if summer would truly return. You weren't sure, but you knew, without laughter, summer was just a distant dream, and you held your son's hand tighter, silently vowing to keep him from forgetting, even if he had to smile through tears, that in the darkest winter, life persisted at any cost. And then, as winter slowly gave way to longer days, as snow melted and earth sprouted its first green shoots, you faced an undeniable truth. You didn't survive winter, you became it. You were no longer someone who passed through the cold with an intact body, but part of it, frozen deep in every breath, every dreamless sleep, every heavy step on wet ground. You'd learned to feel no pain, no loneliness, no memory of what was lost, because you couldn't bear to live with them in your heart. Winter hadn't just covered your village in snow, but seeped into every cell, turning you into a silent, icy entity, cold as the north wind whistling through door cracks. You were no longer human. You were winter's breath, the shadow of mute life, the echo of what had died. And in that transformation, you held your son, the only one still carrying a flicker of light, a faint warmth, to walk together on the endless road with no promised end. You knew, wherever you went, wherever you hid, winter would follow, wrapping you like a cold blanket, impossible to shed. But you also knew, only by becoming winter could you truly exist within it. Could you see the faint light of spring in the distance and hold it until that day truly came? And so, your story wasn't one of surviving winter, but of transforming, adapting, existing, by becoming the winter you couldn't escape. The story of the Dark Age Britons paints a brutal picture of survival in the harshest conditions they faced: skin-cutting cold, endless famine, heartbreaking loss, and the transformation of self to adapt to seemingly insurmountable challenges. In modern America, though not everyone faces such extreme conditions, the story's lessons remain profoundly valuable. First, it reminds us of the importance of preparation and resource management. Just as the Britons hoarded wood and guarded every scrap of food to endure the brutal winter, we too must be mindful of managing finances, health, and personal resources, especially during crises like pandemics or economic upheaval. Second, change and adaptation are inevitable. The Britons went from farmers to thieves, learned to guard blankets to survive, even ate loved ones, painful but driven by survival instinct. In modern society, flexibility, embracing change, and adapting to new circumstances are key to success and maintaining balance. Finally, the story highlights the value of family and sharing in tough times. Though the Britons' lives were torn by cold and hunger, they still found ways to kindle fires together, share meager portions. This reminds us in modern society to foster empathy, support, and connection, especially in challenging moments. From details like a child burning their tent to find the light, or a man talking to the moon, the story vividly captures the longing for light and faith, however small, that can help people overcome the darkest hardships. This is a precious motivator for every American to keep seeking hope and strength in modern life. If this story touched your heart and you want to explore more gripping survival histories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch the next videos. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the darkest winter. See you in the next video with even more surprising and profound stories.